think that's put a lot of food on the table for debate and for taking in and deciphering and asking questions. So we'll open to the floor and maybe let a few people come in with questions or a few comments. I'm going to particularly ask, because sometimes at these meetings we have people who are very political, not to try and make political speeches, but to come in and ask questions and pose the questions as well. So yourself here, sir.
I'm in one of the public service unions. Two questions. First of all, some American commentators have written that this is about a power grab, an attempt for America to dominate politically, and there's some evidence that that's already begun, in that Congress appears to be advancing the idea that disinvestment in Israel will be prohibited under TTIP. It looks like handing over a lot of effective foreign policy to the United States. That's the first thing. Second thing is just a top of the head question for Constantin. I take it that the terrible state of affairs in Italy means that it gets noticeably less foreign investment than most other countries, because nobody trusts the court to do it. I mean, is it really bad and worse in Europe? Worse than us, you know? What is the story in foreign investment in Italy? They all know this, about how long it is to get your money back. But I presume there isn't a penny goes in from abroad to Italy, granted these terrible circumstances. And I know a little about the working of the Italian courts.
Thank you. You put your hands up and I can take us in yourself and yourself. The lady here, yeah.
Hi, I'm not going to make any political speeches, but I totally disagree with what this gentleman has said here. For example, I think people just here should know that the ISDS is actually in progress in our own country. When the people applied for the fracking licence and they were refused it, they are claiming money from the compensation from Northern Ireland under the ISDS programme. And also in Egypt, our own crowd here, their own Viola, they have the waste disposal contract for the whole of Egypt. Egypt put up the minimum wage by 35 cents, and Viola are now reclaiming that from claiming that they did not make enough profit. They are making profit, but we'll just say, for example, they said they were going to make 200 million profit. They're now making 199 million profit, but they're suing the Egyptian government for that loss of anticipated profit. That's what's going to happen here as well. If somebody comes in here, say like the likes of Pfizer or whoever, Marlborough, Philip Morris, whoever, Philip Morris actually are suing in Australia under the ISDS because of they're not publishing, they're reducing the amount of cigarettes they're selling because they're not publishing the emblem of Philip Morris on it. It's rotten to the core. It's totally rotten where collective bargaining and trade unionism is concerned. It's corporate versus people. And there are politicians and lawyers vying to get into this transparent, as he said, transparent system of approaching the courts. That doesn't happen. It's not a court, it's not a judicial system. There's no appeal or reappeal on any decision that is made. And as you said yourself, that gentleman, I forget his name. No, not Frank, it's a gentleman. That he was saying that there's no that people can apply and see it and visualise it. Why so? Where the MEPs that I have spoken to that have gone in, they are allowed in to view, not to discuss, not to look at, not to take away a copy of. They are allowed in to view the TTIP negotiation in Europe. They're not allowed, and they're stripped of their phones, anything at all that they can photograph with, they're not allowed to bring in. So nobody is allowed access. Why is it so clandestine if it's such a brilliant idea?
Thank you. Okay, now, Chair Clay, I'll bring you in here.
Thanks, Chair. Des Fagan from the CPSU, that's the Civil Public and Services Union, not the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Worries. I'd like to address some things that Constantin has said in his, because, you know, the sense of deja vu for Irish people is kind of very strong, because we heard all these deregulation arguments when we were convinced that the idea of Lisbon and Maastricht and everything else was going to deliver us a nirvana of more jobs, and better employment prospects for people, but what it actually delivered for people in Ireland and for people in a lot of countries around the EU was despair and hardship and poverty and deregulation. And the deregulation that you're actually proposing, well, I don't think you're proposing it, obviously, because the corporates are proposing it and they're putting a lot of effort into trying to deregulate markets across the world on the basis that deregulation is a good thing. But we in Ireland know that deregulation is not a good thing. The idea that markets have unfettered ability to make money in any area where they see fit and in any area where they are not opposed seems to be the mantra of people, the corporates. And the actual experience of Irish people, and people probably across the world and working people, is that that's not actually the case. And what I'd like, I suppose, the panel to address, and I noticed Constantin talked about it as well as the internal dispute, I think it's called, what's the internal dispute resolution system. In other words, where a business believes that it has been disrupted or it cannot make its money in the way it thought it could make its money, can take a government to court. For instance, and the specific example is, I believe, because I've read it somewhere, and I stand to be corrected, is a Swedish power company took the German government to court because after Fukushima, when the nuclear plant was disrupted because of the invasion of water and everything else, and people's lives were put at risk, the German government decided that nuclear power was not the way forward, so they abandoned their nuclear process. Okay, so this Swedish company who had plans to build nuclear power plants in Germany said, right, we'll take the German government to this IS, whatever it's called, the internal.
ISDS.
Yeah, we'll take them to that, and we will take them to court because they have stopped us from making a profit. So I'd like the panel to address, why does deregulation seem to be the way out all the time of everybody's woes? Because as far as people I talk to is concerned, it's not.
Okay, there's
Thank you.
there's one more hand here. Sorry, yourself. And then I'm going to take two more in, and then we'll ask the speakers to come back.
Just a
Yourself,
couple of quick things. First of all, like where the last speaker there referred to referendums that we had, where I feel we were duped and lied to, and things went through, the like austerity treaty most recently. How come something as huge as this wouldn't have to go to a referendum? That, you know, this seems to be an absolute grab of rights by corporations from people. And the other thing is, who is all this trading going to be with? If sort of the whole of the West, except for maybe Australia or somewhere, is in this big agreement thing. You know, surely, like, the Irish government wants to be selling beef to the US or whatever, but are there rich countries much left out of this to be trading to, that this is going to be so worth it?
Okay, sorry, and then step down here. And then I'm going to take the speakers back in again, but people, you know, come in, don't be afraid, ask the questions that are in your head there, because this is an opportunity to tease them out.
Yeah, Barry Finning is my name. I'm a researcher with the Association for the Taxation of Financial Transactions and Aid of Citizens. ATTAC, it's a very long name. But I've been following this for some time now, and just two issues, the precautionary principle and the ISDS. The first one is, I'd like to find out what Constantin thinks about the precautionary principle. The EU Commission for over a year now is very much on the record that we have to get rid of the precautionary principle. It's a very brief example as to what it means. I don't know if you've heard of bee colony collapse disorder, but 80% of our food comes from food that's pollinated by bees, and they're dying in their millions. About 80% of the bees are gone. So, cut a long story short, about 10 years ago, a new chemical called neonicotinoids was introduced throughout the world. 2 years ago, we put a moratorium on it in Europe because of the precautionary principle. In other words, there are 1 or 2 scientists in the world, or there are maybe more, who could stand in court and say, you can't prove that this chemical is the reason for the bees dying. There are lots of other scientists who say, on the balance of probabilities, it probably is, let's ban it and see what happens. Well, we did ban it, based on the legal principle of the precautionary principle, and guess what, the bee population is coming back in Europe. The lobbyist in America and the American government is very, very clear that we have an anti-science perspective. Because in America, you, the government, must prove that the chemical is bad, whereas in Europe, you, the producer, must prove the chemical is safe. So this idea that European food and health and safety standards aren't going to be reduced as a result of TTIP, it may sound nice, it's a good soundbite, but it's disingenuous and it's counterintuitive to what the Commission is actually saying. And so what will end up happening is, we in Europe, we have 1,200 chemicals which we believe cause cancer, endocrine disruption and other things in cosmetics, and we ban them. 1,200. In America, they have 12 chemicals. So what's going to happen is, cosmetics manufacturers in Europe, when the worst case scenario standards are harmonised, the best case scenario is its regulatory recognition. So the chemical with the cancer-causing endocrine disruptor that you spray on your head or put on your face gets made in America, and we can't ban it because we respect each other's safety standards. And our factories are going to up sticks and go to America, where the production costs are lower, and they can use whatever chemicals they like and sell the same stuff back, so we're going to see jobs going across. So what I don't understand is why the precautionary principle has to go. Just very briefly on the ISDS, the country in South America that gets the most foreign direct investment by far is Brazil. It has no ISDS. The country in Europe that gets by far the most foreign direct investment is Ireland. We have no ISDS. What I would say is, isn't it a lot more intelligent to respect the separation of powers of the executive, the government and the judiciary? Isn't it a lot more sensible to have corporations on the same level as citizens and other small and medium-sized businesses? We're all equal before the law. And rather than embracing an ISDS where we throw out a situation where judges are obliged to weigh up the right of a business to make a few bob, and the right of the citizen to be protected, and the right of the government to regulate. And that we continue doing that in the courts. And rather than bringing us all down to this ridiculous corporate special court for the superhero corporations, if they're going to make an investment, let them take out insurance. And if the Italians need help with their court system, maybe we could all chip in and give them a hand.
I want to check with Constantine, first of all, how I understood something correctly. It's to do with the point you just made about regulation. What I thought you were saying really was that the EU are saying nothing important, like anything you just mentioned, will be covered. It'll all be exempted from the street. That's what you said. You said you don't necessarily believe it, but that's what the position is. And then what I think you're saying is that the only things that will be affected are relatively unimportant, where standards are relatively similar. I want to know, is that a fair summary of what you're saying around regulation? Right, but then the next point I want to ask is about you seem to have an open mind about the arbitration panels. Now, my impression, again, it just builds on what you just said over there, is that arbitration panels can make some pretty weird decisions. The one I was talking about in the car on the way in was the one in Russia, where I think some of the oligarchs ended up with $50 billion. I can't remember what the currency is, but it wasn't lira, it was something quite significant. As a result of one of those decisions, which you probably know a bit about. So they're quite worrying. And I suppose the point I'd make is that at least when a court makes the decision, we may not like our Irish court system, we may not think the legal system is brilliant, but at least there's some measure of democratic control over it. A panel of 3 people appointed by whoever it is, but there's no right of appeal, no matter how transparent you can see what they're doing, but we can have no influence over the decision. It can't be as good as a court system that has some kind of democratic control over it.
Thank you. Okay, Constantine, if you want to come in and answer those few points, and then Frank, you want to make a closing.
It's a lot of, so I might actually miss some questions. I tried to write down absolutely everything. I'll start from the top actually, rather than from the back there. Power grab, US dominate the EU politically. I don't know, to be honest. I don't see any foreign, in terms of the EU dominating, US dominating the EU politically, this is not really TTIP. I don't think, maybe there is such an agenda. I have no idea. I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories. There is no foreign policy implications from TTIP other than trade policy implications. There's somebody actually, I think you mentioned this spillover to other countries as well, and these are serious, okay? So there is a big knock-on effect from TTIP on the countries which are producing lower value-added goods, for example. The manufacturers of those, the likes of Bangladesh and all, are going to see probably loss of income. The commodities trading countries will probably see an increase of income. So there is a bit of an issue of that. EU somewhat recognizes that there is a proposal which came actually out of the CSI4 Institute in Germany as to how to mitigate it. They have about 5 points that they would like the EU to address during negotiations of TTIP to mitigate the effect on third countries, on developing countries in particular there as well. So that's very quickly. Italy FDI. Well, no, Italy does get FDI. Italy also has 3 countries in it, okay? The central Italy gets very little FDI. Most of that FDI comes into the government-related sector, which is dominant in central Italy. Southern Italy gets it into the tourism and hospitality, very little of it, really, and very small amounts. And northern Italy, which is effectively an extension of Austria and Switzerland, gets plenty of FDI, okay? Now, northern Italy so happens to be is autonomous, as in they have fairly flexible taxation system, which is their own. They have pretty different system of governance, administration, and the likes. Now they share in the Italian courts, so the northern Italian courts are as slow as the general Italian courts, okay? So there's an issue there. Now Italy gets very little FDI, unfortunately. It gets so little FDI and general investment internally, despite having fairly high rates of savings, which primarily go to fund their government bonds, that 10% annually of their best, most educated young people immigrate. That hasn't happened during the crisis. It has happened from around the middle of the 1990s, since we have the data, which is consistent. So, no, Italy is a basket case, okay? And I love that country. I'm married to a woman who is half Italian, and we have a family home there as well. So, profit guarantees versus contracts, and the Australia case of the ISDS. Yes, correct. Australian case of the ISDS is about profit guarantees. The problem is that the companies do receive likes of Egypt, even closer here, pullback where I live. Keoghan there has received the explicit guarantees under the contract as to how much revenue they will extract out of the production. We now know that Dublin City cannot deliver that revenue to them because there isn't enough trash being generated. But, nonetheless, we have made now an agreement to track trash from other adjoining counties into pullback, so as to burn it there so that Keoghan doesn't take us to any sort of court for breach of contract. It's exactly the same in Egypt, and very similar in Australia, by the way. But in Australia, the case of being considered under the tobacco case, plain packaging case, is actually more interesting. It relates to the 1938. That's how long ago that agreement was signed, the agreement with Hong Kong. Yes, correct. So I would say that to say that something from 1938 is not quite working the way we would like it to work today, therefore we shouldn't do anything similar, to it with different format. It's kind of a little bit, strange, because the cars weren't working very well in 1938 either. We still do have them, thank God. But the other issue also, of course, are the guarantees valid, by the way? Well, I'm sorry, if the idiot somewhere in a central procurement clinic has signed a contract which guarantees the private sector investor a guaranteed rate of return on their assets, I'm sorry, that's a bloody contract, okay? Kick that person who wrote that contract out. But the company, well, you're gonna have to pay them. That's a contract. This is why it is important to have the governance system which doesn't allow the biggest incinerator in Europe to be built in the city bloody center on a bay in an environmentally sensitive area where people and children are breathing the air from the entire city, largest city in the country, against the will of the city council, because an appointed bureaucrat decided that that would be a good idea, who is now retired and running, well, what is running now? Sorry, okay? So I'm sorry, it goes back to my issue. Don't blame the paper, blame the people who created that paper in the first place. Deregulation, good or bad? Some deregulation good, some deregulation bad. What's even worse than deregulation or regulation, over-regulation or under-regulation? The worst case is lack of supervision and enforcement. Ireland did not have deregulated banking sector. We did not. Do you realize how much each independent director in the bank has to go through in order to comply with the directives requiring them to be fit for purpose, to be sitting on that bloody board. Years and years and years of adult education, painful boredom from the economists and the likes being taught to them. None of it is, by the way, relevant to anything that they're going to be doing in that boardroom. But there are regulations. The problem, we failed to enforce those regulations. And in the several cases that we now know and have been documented, the failure of enforcement of regulation was brought and notified to the Financial Regulator Office repeatedly with evidence by people who were supposed to do so. And when they did so, they were fired from their jobs. And now they are unemployed and sitting on the welfare because they can't get the job. These are high-end professionals in risk management who did that. They were whistleblowers. And the financial regulator did not act on that notification, on these notifications. So it's not the lack of regulation. There was a law which said that these particular breaches were punishable by imprisonment for up to 3 years. That law was written in Ireland. There were Gardaí who were standing by supposedly to enforce the law. There were courts who were standing by supposedly to issue the sentences. And the people who notified of the breach of that law have not been listened to. So it's lack of enforcement, which is far worse than just deregulation or over-regulation itself. Why is there is not going to be a referendum? As far as I understand, on a constitutional person, there is no change of constitution, therefore we're not required to have a referendum. Should we have a referendum? Frankly, I don't know. It's so bloody technical that half of that stuff I can't comprehend, without a bottle of whiskey, and another half even with a bottle of whiskey, okay? Countries left out of the TTIP, that I think you asked that question. I mentioned that, very important issue, often overlooked. Some NGOs, to their credit, actually are raising that issue in Europe, and that's a very good thing that they do because it is an important issue. There will be losers. EU, by the way, not the US so much, because the US has the preferential treatment status with pretty much most of the countries around the world in terms of trade, but the EU has in the past erected the barriers against the countries which are outside of its trade cooperation zone. So in other words, the barriers to trade rightly goes down once the countries cooperating under the agreement, but the rest of the world usually experiences the rise of the barriers. So let's hope that's not going to be the case now as well, and in the future generally. Precautionary principle. I like risk management, and throughout the entire crisis in the banking sector and in finance, I've been saying that the precautionary principle should always apply in all public decision-making and policy. I cannot say that the precautionary principle is wrong. I think it is right. This is why I personally do not like GMOs. Not because I'm convinced that they're killing me or killing someone else, but because I'm not convinced that they're not. Okay? That's do no harm principle. And I have no problem with this bloody principle. And if the American negotiators insist on it, that that is something wrong, well, I'm sorry. Okay? I disagree with that. Okay? So I think it's a very important principle to preserve. However, there is also balance. Okay? And that balance, for example, swings the other way. They do apply precautionary principle very strongly in terms of, for example, medicines. That's why we are in Europe guinea pigs for a lot of the, international pharmaceutical companies, not just, American pharmaceutical companies, because we approve drugs much faster than the Americans do, because Americans insist on much more evidence and clean evidence and the likes. TTIP actually might help here, because as I said before, the clinical trials data, for example, can be much better harmonized in that case, and therefore any researcher, any assessor of the efficacy of the medicines might have access to better and cheaper data. If that's the case, that's good, okay? Now I'm finishing it because there's two more just questions and I'll be very brief with that. Brazil, Ireland as the attractors of FDI. Almighty, yes, when I read Michael Noonan speaking in the Indo this week saying that, Greece should have done what Ireland has done, the right thing, and cut, the debt by restructuring it and everything else and getting all this financial engineering. That reminds me of this question as well. Of course, the reason why we got lower interest rates on our loans in 2011 and 2012 was precisely because Greece got theirs. And then our own Minister of Finance came to Europe and said, that's just terrible. That's just, we've been doing everything here. We've been really good boys, and you give us something. And the EU said, I sure have, And that's what it was, okay? So in a sense, he was admonishing Greece for doing what Greece did to us and suggesting that we should be doing, they should be doing what we should have done from their lives, okay? So it's the same thing exactly. Ireland and Brazil are very idiosyncratic in terms of the investment. Most of our investment, most of our FDI has nothing to do with any regimes here. other than one regime called double Irish. Now being replaced and renamed like Troika in Greece with institutions, we now have the knowledge development box. Okay? It's like the airplane black box. Everyone knows it's there, nobody knows what it does, and everyone looks at it after something happens. Okay? It's the same thing. Brazil is another one. In Brazil, most of FDI is Petrobras. Okay? Now Petrobras is a brilliant company. Average cost of extraction of oil around the world is about 55, 60 a barrel, $1, yes? The most expensive other than Petrobras in the world is about 110 a barrel, okay? And that's in Venezuela where they're really not doing a very good job. Petrobras cost of extraction of a barrel of oil is $185 US. Now, you should scratch your head, yes? The most expensive price we had was just under 120, yes? And they're extracting at 185. They need a lot of foreign direct investment. Okay, so Brazil is a very strange beast, okay, in itself. Generally, good quality investment, whether domestic investment or foreign investment into the country, and I'm not talking about portfolio investment, I'm talking about equity investment into the companies or investment into private equity and the projects and the likes, okay, happens when the institutions are right. Ireland has fairly good institutions. We're ranked very highly in terms of the protection of investors, in some areas too high probably as well. But nonetheless, we are ranked very high. That's why we don't need ISDS. By the way, ISDS, in Europe, there are 1,400 ISDS agreements. All of them are in under different regimes and under different structures. EU is under TTIP, by the way, proposing to harmonize all of them internally here in Europe under one standard before TTIP. Okay? And that standard is that United Nations Convention on it as well. So I'll finish on that stage. I think I covered all of the questions, so thanks.
Thank you. Cheers.
I'm going to sit down because I'm older than Constantin. And I'm starting at the back as well with the Yukos case. I was in Russia, and I'm not going to make any judgment on the oligarchs or Russia's seizure of their property, etc. But what I do, the point I want to make is that the judgment for 50 billion, which was 10% of the annual national budget, or 2.5% of the country's GDP, was made under the Energy Charter Treaty. Russia never signed the Energy Charter Treaty. And what happened was that there was a period between completion of the let's say, provisional application of the treaty and the actual signing and coming into effect of the treaty. And there was a long gap in time between a number of years between the two events, the conclusion of the negotiations and the initialing and the actual signing and coming into effect. And Russia got caught in that because one of the clauses in the treaty said that this period of provisional application would be open for ISDS cases. And the reason that I'm saying that is not so much that I'm interested in the Yukos case, but to tell you that a similar clause seems to be implicit in the Canadian EU agreement. And I actually have the text here, and it says, this agreement shall be provisionally applied from the first day of the month following the date on which the parties have notified each other that their respective relevant procedures have been completed. The key there is the words relevant procedures, because they are not defined anywhere at all in the actual agreement itself, and it's been published. And then it follows with that, if the provisional application of this agreement, this is the period between when it's initialed and when it comes into effect, if the provisional application of this agreement is terminated, in other words, if any of the countries do not enter into agreement, or if the EU itself should, for whatever reason, decide not to engage with the CETA, then a claim may be submitted pursuant to the provisions of this agreement regarding any matter arising during the period of provisional application of this agreement, pursuant to the rules and procedures established in this agreement, and provided no more than 3 years have elapsed since the date of termination of the provisional application. So in actual fact, 3 years after it comes into effect, plus the provisional period, would allow a country that has not acceded to it, or anywhere in the EU, if the EU doesn't accede to it, to be sued under ISDS. That seems to me mad. But that's what Russia got caught in with the, not right, that's what they got caught in, under the Energy Charter Treaty. Somebody asked about trade. 28% is the best estimate that the Commission can come up with. 28% bilateral trade with the US under the TTIP agreement. Now, the problem with it is that a lot of intra-EU trade will then cease, so suck out a lot of intra-EU trade. And in my view, it leaves EU countries very open to any sort of setbacks in the US. And that they might be able to take measures, except for counter-cyclical measures are just not available to them. We don't have in the EU Central Fiscal Authority, for example, and the Maastricht Treaty forbids fiscal expansion. So all you can see in a situation like that, if the US and trade has moved in that direction, 28% is their figure, whether you believe it or not, would be widespread dislocation of workers. That's one of the things, and of course some of the people who own the factories will lose a lot of money as well. So that's, yes, why not a referendum? The ratification procedures, I was just only today looking at a statement from the Minister of Trade, we must have missed the Bruton's department. I'm not quite sure now, it came out yesterday. Which said that the procedures would be, a proposal would be sent to the Council would read it, send it on to the Parliament would approve it, and then it would go back to the Council for final approval. That's the European Council I'm talking about. Now, they say, and there's been a lot of contradictions in this, I have to be quite honest. Mr. Bruton's department says every country will have a say. The Greeks seem to think that they can veto the agreement, but it would appear now that the Commission thinks, oh well look, if every country votes in Council, which they would, that's enough. That's how the countries will approve. So these arise as a result of the Lisbon Treaty, these approval methods. Prior to that,
QMV.
Yeah, this QMV down.
That's right, yeah.
I don't want to go through the QMV and 55% and all the rest of it. You can read that up if you wish. But they arise as a result of our approving the Lisbon Treaty at the second vote. Why does the regulation seem to be the way over these walls? Well, it's not. I think that's fairly clear. There are good regulations and there are bad regulations. And there are good regulations as well. Absolutely, I'm not going to go into anything more than that. Transparency, I don't honestly think that the public getting in to meetings of the panels, making ISDS judgments, is transparent. It doesn't add to transparency. The decisions will still be made. The actual decisions will still be made somewhere else. The public won't be able to affect the outcome of any of the decisions. I mean, it's a veneer of transparency. And by the way, we have no idea whatsoever what demands the US is making on the EU. We have no idea at all. And Mr. Obama has been very adamant the last few weeks. The EU can release what it likes. The US is not going to release anything. Fracking is a very interesting phenomenon. I don't want to go into the actual mechanics of fracking, but I do want to mention a situation that occurred in Canada. Lone Pine Resources. People were very upset because there was an attempt to frack under the St. Lawrence River. And apparently it's a bit unstable geologically or something like that. So eventually, anyway, the government, I think of Quebec, banned the fracking. But Lone Pine, which is a Canadian firm that had done a good lot of exploratory work in the area, decided that they would sue Canada under the US-Canada agreement, NAFTA. How could they do that? Well, they went off down to Tennessee and they established a subsidiary, effectively, in the US, and they sued them from the US. Now, I have to say that one of the things in CETA is the Canadian-EU agreement, says you cannot set up a postbox company and then sue. That's I have to say that's it, and that's a welcome development as far as it goes. So that kind of racket certainly wouldn't go on here. The Egyptian one, in a way, is, well, they sued the city of Alexandria for $89 million because they increased the minimum wage for the bin man, effectively the bin. And because the police did not act effectively to stop the rolling of dustbins. There you are, the old one. I don't know much about FBI and Italy, so I won't say anything about it. I don't really subscribe to conspiracy theories at all myself, despite what some people might think. It's too easy to have a conspiracy theory. American political dominance of Europe, I don't honestly believe that that's the primary issue with TTIP. I think the primary issue is corporate dominance of Europe and corporate dominance of the United States. Who runs America? I mean, you don't have to be a libertarian to realise it's all done by lobbying. You know, the effectiveness of government and the ability of the government to administer, which it's supposed to do, is severely constrained by lobbyists. And the same thing would develop in Europe. And by the way, there are 15,000 to 20,000 lobbyists in Brussels at the moment. And we can certainly say they are actively involved in writing some of the regulations. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Whatever about directives, I'm not too sure. I'm sure they have a great say in it. And there are a lot of the B-class legislation in Europe could be written by them because it just simply passes by. Nobody reads it. Nobody reads it at all. And Mr. Kenny got up in the Dáil 2 weeks ago and said, oh, there were a lot of B-class regulations that went through. Nobody asked him what the hell were those. You know, this is where we're sitting. I mean, that is far from a US takeover of Europe. I think, yes, with what's called globalization, yes, certainly there are similarities, and because of NATO and all the rest, there's obviously common foreign policy concerns, which would certainly lead you to believe that American influence in Europe is increasing. But I don't think that TTIP is part of that project. I think both countries are captive within TTIP.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Frank.